Pastor John Gray walking into Bishop T.D. Jakes' church wasn't just a Sunday surprise. It was something that shook the entire gospel community. The moment he stepped through those doors, you could feel that something big was about to happen. People turned their heads, whispers filled the air, and phones were pulled out faster than you could imagine. You won't believe how quickly the news spread. Within minutes, photos and short clips were already floating around online. It wasn't just another church visit. It felt like history in the making. And let me tell you, this is how it all started. A quiet Sunday morning at the Potter's house in Dallas, filled with energy, music, and worship. But destiny took an unexpected turn the moment Pastor John Gray walked in. For years, John Gray had been one of the most talked about preachers in America. His words, his passion, and his humor made him loved by thousands. But fame comes with a cost, and Gray's story wasn't always one of victory. He had faced storms, big ones. Controversies, rumors, and public criticism had followed him for years. People had called him many things: talented, emotional, even broken. But that morning, as he entered Bishop Jakes' church, he didn't look like a man trying to make headlines. He looked like someone searching for peace. What made this story different was the emotion that surrounded it. It wasn't just about preaching or forgiveness. It was about facing the past in front of everyone who had once praised and judged him. Eyewitnesses said that the room changed the second Gray stepped inside. The choir was still singing, but the atmosphere felt heavier, more intense. People glanced at one another, some surprised, some unsure. A few even clapped quietly, while others simply watched in silence. The craziest part was that nobody knew if this visit was planned or if it was something spontaneous, something led by faith. But here's the shocking part. Insiders later said Bishop Jakes already knew he was coming. Still, even with that knowledge, nobody expected what would unfold. Next, Gray took his seat near the front, close enough for everyone to see him clearly. He smiled a little, nodded to familiar faces, and kept his focus on the pulpit. Some described his expression as peaceful. Others said it looked like he was holding back tears. Either way, you could tell this wasn't an ordinary moment. This was a man walking straight into a place connected deeply to his past. And if you knew their history, the bond between Bishop Jakes and John Gray, you'd know why this moment hit so hard. Years ago, Bishop Jakes had been more than just a mentor to Gray. He had been like a spiritual father. When John Gray was still rising, Jakes had guided him, prayed with him, and believed in him. So when everything in Gray's life began to fall apart, when scandals and criticism surrounded him, many wondered if that mentorship was broken too. But now, here he was walking back into the very church where he once found guidance. And this is where it gets interesting. Nobody knew if this was a visit of humility or a quiet cry for help. The service started as usual, but you could tell everyone's attention was divided. Every time someone mentioned grace or redemption, eyes shifted toward Gray. The choir's voices filled the air, but beneath it, attention grew stronger. Some people whispered that maybe John was here to apologize. Others thought it was a setup, a move to win back public favor. But for those watching closely, his body language said something different. He wasn't there to be seen, he was there to be forgiven. Let me tell you, as minutes passed, the energy in that room changed completely. What began as curiosity slowly turned into emotion. There were people crying quietly in their seats, as if they knew they were witnessing something bigger than gossip. Bishop Jakes hadn't taken the pulpit yet, but everyone was waiting for him. They wanted to see how he'd react, what he'd say, and most of all, whether he'd acknowledge the man sitting only a few rows away. And when Bishop Jakes finally stepped up, the crowd roared. But the real moment wasn't the applause. It was the silence that followed. You could feel every heart beating in sync, waiting. The bishop began his sermon as usual, speaking about forgiveness, faith, and the power of coming home after a storm. But here's the shocking part. Every word seemed to connect directly to John Gray's story. People began to whisper again, wondering if this sermon was meant for him. Some even said they saw Gray lower his head, quietly wiping his eyes. As Bishop Jakes continued preaching, the air inside the church felt heavier with every word. People weren't just listening, they were holding their breath. The sermon was powerful, but it wasn't just about scripture. It felt personal. He spoke about men who fall but choose to rise again, about broken vessels being used by God, and about the strength it takes to return when the world has already judged you. This is where it gets interesting. Every sentence felt like a message meant for John Gray, even though his name was never mentioned. Gray sat there, head bowed, hands clasped tightly together. It was as if every word was cutting straight through him. You won't believe how still the room became. It was so quiet that even the sound of a chair moving seemed loud. People were looking at Bishop Jakes, then back at Gray, wondering if something big was about to happen. And then destiny took an unexpected turn. In the middle of his sermon, Bishop Jakes paused. His voice softened and his tone shifted. Sometimes, he said, the hardest thing for a man to do is to show up, especially after he's been through the fire. The crowd froze. Some people gasped quietly. Others whispered, "He's talking about John." For a moment, it felt like the entire world had stopped spinning. Then, Bishop Jakes looked out toward the congregation, his eyes searching. Everyone knew who he was looking for. John Gray slowly lifted his head, his eyes red, his face heavy with emotion. Then it happened. The moment nobody expected. Bishop Jakes extended his hand and said, "Come here, son." That single sentence broke every wall in the room. People started crying. Phones came out. And as John Gray stood up, the entire church went silent. He walked slowly toward the front, each step feeling heavier than the last. You could see years of pain and regret written on his face. This wasn't the confident preacher people remembered. This was a man humbled by his own story. He reached the altar, and for a second, he hesitated. But Bishop Jakes stepped forward, opened his arms, and pulled him into a long, tight embrace. The crowd erupted, clapping, shouting, crying. Let me tell you, it was raw. It was real. You could feel the emotion even through a screen. Later, the craziest part, no one had planned it. There was no script, no announcement, no warning. Just two men, one broken, one forgiving, standing at the altar in front of thousands. For that moment, there was no past, no scandal, no judgment, only grace. People said they saw tears in both men's eyes. Others said they heard Bishop Jakes whisper something into Gray's ear, though nobody could say what it was. Some who were close enough claimed they heard him say, "You're still called." And when they heard that, the entire church erupted again. Applause, shouting, and a flood of emotion that even the cameras couldn't capture completely. But here's the shocking part. Not everyone was clapping. Some faces in the crowd stayed still, their expressions mixed with confusion and hesitation. For some, it was too soon. For others, it was the perfect picture of grace. Either way, everyone knew they had just witnessed something that would be talked about for years. As the music began again, people kept recording, tears streaming down their faces. Even those who didn't know John Gray's full story felt the weight of that moment. It wasn't just about two pastors, it was us. It was about forgiveness, about facing your mistakes and still standing. And yet, behind that powerful embrace, there was another story waiting to unfold, because after the service, something happened that nobody saw on camera. And it would add a whole new layer to this already emotional story. After the service ended, most of the congregation stayed longer than usual. People hugged, whispered to each other, and some cried quietly as they replayed the moment they had just witnessed. But John Gray didn't linger with the crowd. He quietly made his way to a side corridor accompanied by a few staff members and close friends from the church. Nobody outside really knew where he was going, and that's when the story took a new, more private turn. Let me tell you, this is how the real heart of the story began. Bishop Jakes invited John Gray into his private office, away from cameras, microphones, and the watching world. For nearly an hour, the two men talked alone, in a space where no one could see them. Insiders later described the meeting as emotional and intense. Gray reportedly shared his regrets, his struggles, and the challenges he had faced during his years of controversy. You won't believe how raw this conversation was. It wasn't rehearsed or staged. It was two men confronting years of pain, mistakes, and unspoken truths. Bishop Jakes, known for his wisdom and fatherly guidance, listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it wasn't easy words. It was honest advice meant to guide Gray back toward a path of accountability, healing, and spiritual restoration. He reportedly told Gray that redemption doesn't erase responsibility and that rebuilding trust and credibility would take time and consistency, not just public appearances. The conversation was described as both firm and compassionate, a mix that could heal but also challenge at the same time. But here's the shocking part. Even after such a private and sincere meeting, the story didn't stay private for long. Word began to spread through social media and church networks. Clips from the service were shared everywhere, with hashtags like John Gray Returns and Grace in Action. Trending across multiple platforms, people started debating, was this a true act of forgiveness or a calculated move to rebuild a public image? Some argued it was a genuine spiritual moment, while others suggested it was carefully orchestrated. And just when everyone thought they had seen everything, new footage began surfacing. The new clips showed angles that weren't visible during the live stream. Some showed Gray breaking down in tears before Bishop Jakes approached him. Others captured security, moving a few overzealous attendees away, highlighting how emotional the crowd had become. The craziest part, people started questioning the timing of it all. Was the sermon, the embrace, and the private meeting just a coincidence? Or was it planned in a way that nobody could have predicted? Social media exploded with speculation, and even well-known Christian commentators joined the conversation, taking sides and debating the meaning of every moment. Let me tell you, this wasn't just a story about two men. It was about the power of perception, the challenge of true forgiveness, and how one public act can ignite millions of opinions in hours. People began to ask questions about accountability, grace, and whether the church should publicly restore leaders before proving full repentance. Others said the moment was a perfect example of how faith, humility, and redemption can intersect. And all the while, John Gray's quiet demeanor, his tears, and his willingness to face his past made the entire situation feel deeply human and painfully real. Even after the service ended and the private meeting concluded, the conversation continued to ripple outward. Some members of the congregation called it historic, others called it controversial. But everyone agreed on one thing. What had happened that day was powerful, emotional, and unforgettable. And yet, the story wasn't over, because days later, even more surprising details began to emerge, adding a new twist to an already intense moment. Days after John Gray's visit, new information began circulating that added another layer to the story. Some reports suggested that influential figures within the Christian community had quietly encouraged the meeting, hoping it could mark a new chapter for Gray's public image and ministry. Others believed it was purely spiritual, a step toward healing and restoration rather than publicity. Either way, the speculation only made the story bigger. Social media was filled with debates, some praising the moment as a beautiful act of grace, others criticizing it as a calculated move to regain favor. But the truth was far more complicated. and what really happened behind closed doors remained a mystery to the public. Let me tell you, this is where the story took another unexpected twist. Clips and photos that had been initially celebrated for their emotional impact were re-examined. Some angles showed Gray's emotions in a way that raised questions, tears, hesitation, and a mix of relief and vulnerability. Comments began to pour in. Was this real? Some asked. Was it orchestrated? Others demanded. Yet, many viewers insisted that no one could fake that kind of raw, human emotion. And here's the craziest part. The debate itself became part of the story, showing just how much people care about forgiveness, redemption, and authenticity. Meanwhile, John Gray seemed to retreat from the spotlight. For the first time in years, he stayed relatively quiet on social media, letting the moment speak for itself. Sources close to him said he was reflecting on the advice Bishop Jakes had given, focusing on rebuilding his credibility and ministry, step by step, away from the public eye. It was as if the embrace, the sermon, and the private conversation had marked a turning point, not just in public perception, but in his own journey of faith and redemption. But here's the shocking part. Even as the public and media analyzed every detail, the real transformation was quieter and more profound. Those who had witnessed the moment in person described a sense of peace and closure, a release of years of tension and judgment. Some members of the congregation said they had never felt anything like it in a church before, a raw, unfiltered demonstration of grace and forgiveness. It was messy, it was emotional, and it was deeply human. And that, perhaps, is what made it so unforgettable. As the story settled into public memory, it left behind questions that continue to spark debate. Can fallen leaders truly be restored in the eyes of the church and the world? How do grace and accountability coexist in moments that are so public and emotional? And for John Gray, this single visit may have been more than a return to the Potter's house. It may have been a turning point in his life, his faith, and his ministry. Destiny took an unexpected turn that Sunday, and in the end, what we witnessed wasn't just a story about controversy. It was a story about humanity, forgiveness, and the powerful, sometimes messy, ways that grace can work. The moment, the embrace, and the quiet conversations that followed will be remembered for years. Some will call it a lesson in forgiveness. Others will call it a moment of redemption. But one thing is certain. No one who saw it, in person or online, could ever forget the weight of that day. You won't believe how a single visit could change the narrative of two men, a congregation, and a whole conversation about faith, mistakes, and second chances.